Okay, good afternoon, and everybody. We are in the Rhythm Discovery Center in Indianapolis, talking to the Operations and Education Manager, Mr. Rob Funkhauser, who has agreed to take time off from his busy schedule for the Arnold Bacchus Society. So, Rob, thanks for your time, and maybe you could start out by telling us a little bit about yourself and then about the center.
Sure. My name is, like you said, my name is Rob Funkhauser, and I've been working for Percussive Art Society for about 3 years. I'm also a composer and instrument builder, which is what initially drew me to the museum. Our museum, the Rhythm Discovery Center, originally started in Lawton, Oklahoma under the name the Percussive Art Society Museum. When they moved to Indianapolis about 10 years ago in 2009, they decided to rebrand the museum as an interactive spot. So as you see inside, the museum is a balance between historical objects and things that we teach kids how to play, and people get to make a lot of noise in here as well.
Okay, so maybe we can take a little tour of the museum now.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. This instrument right here is one of our actually older instruments in the museum. It's a slit drum from Papua New Guinea that was acquired by a percussionist by the name of Emil Richards. Emil was a famous Hollywood percussionist, was Steven Spielberg's go-to percussionist for many decades. And he used to often take tours of Pacific Islands and other parts of the world and trade easily attainable instruments in America for instruments they couldn't get, or he couldn't get. So he traded a vibraphone for this particular instrument. As you can see, it's pretty ornately carved. It was made in the early 20th century, and during the year, it would stand upright like this, but when they would play it, they would actually lay it down in the sand, and a few people along each side would play it at the same time. This one is ceremonial, so it would be played about once or twice a year. All right, this drum here is known as a gong drum. It's made by Remo, as you can tell from the logo. This one is one of two that were made for the Rose Bowl parade in Los Angeles in 2004. Here we have it suspended from cables. In the past, they would have it on a rolling cart for the parades. It sounds pretty good, and it's essentially a large frame drum. All right, so this marimba right here is known as the Canterbury marimba. It was made by Claire Omar Musser during the early days of the Musser Company, before it was sold to Ludwig. And it features Coca-Cola bars in this black finish, as well as these stylish exteriors. He was very into the visual aesthetics of the instruments. There's also a built-in metronome and tuner to this instrument, and apart from that, it also features an extra set of resonators that are purely decorative underneath. And they made about 130 of these. This particular one was Musser's instrument, and then there are about 130 more made for special orders over the years. So this instrument here is called a Marvin, and it was made by a maker called Morph Beats, which is run by a guy named Adam Morford in Boulder, Colorado. It's an interesting piece. All of these are handmade and hand welded. This is number one, actually. It was the first one that was made, and he generously donated it to the museum. So it's played by just hitting it. And it's capable of a wide variety of sounds. Adam Morford also makes bows and other things to play with this, and makes a wide variety of smaller instruments as well.
Okay.
So this instrument here is called a Leedy Octarimba. It was made in Indianapolis at the Leedy Company, which is about 2 miles away from the museum, where the museum is now. it's set up in octaves like a 12-string guitar. So each note is split into 2 bars, and each one is an octave apart. And it's like this all the way up. And the only famous piece probably written for it in the orchestral repertoire would have been Bluebeard's Castle by Bartók. A lot of people think he used an octarimbà because he basically writes for these impossible octaves that can't be played by one person without one of these.
Ah, okay.
And he would have had access to one.
Interesting. Okay.
This instrument is known as a meaty timp bass, and it was made for the Green brothers when George Hamilton and Joe Green had a famous ragtime band. This was also made at the Leedy Company here in Indianapolis, and it's basically a timpani show, and then a bass neck affixed to it. So it operates like a large banjo, essentially.
So do you also beat the drum while you play the bass? You do both at once?
I think he just played it like a bass, almost like to get almost like a washed up sound. This instrument right here is called the Maestro Marimba Metron, and is Claire Musser's personal drum machine. So it's a modified version of the Wurlitzer Sideman, and features altered controls as well as real cymbals inside the machine that are hit by actuators that are triggered by the mechanism. On top, there are a few minimal controls. It's basically preset patterns that you could add or take away from certain instruments. And then there are 8 preset patterns and 10 sounds total. And he could play this. He would often change patterns or hit sounds with his mallets. And on the top of this instrument, you can actually see where his mallets hit the instrument.
This is an altered version
Yes.
of the Marimba Metron.
Yeah, well, this is the original. And then the Marimba Metron was a modified version of this. So this is an original Wurlitzer Sideman with the case taken off so you can see the electronics. This vibraphone here is an original Leedy steel-keyed vibraphone. So before aluminum took over as the main material to use, and also this is before a damper pedal was used. So essentially, players would dampen it with their mallets or by hand, and it had a motor that was not adjustable. You just plugged it in and either turned it on or turned it off. This one was made in the 20s, 1924, at the Leedy factory here in Indianapolis. This vibraphone right here, the Neoclassic, was a prototype that was built by Claire Musser for an instrument design competition in Paris in 1941. It features a dual manual for a vibraphone, which is very unusual. In fact, this is the only one I know of that exists like this. This actually creates some problems because you need 2 damper bars instead of just the one in the middle. But it was a very beautiful instrument, and I think it won the competition. But the idea behind this was to make a vibraphone that was beautiful enough to put in your home, much like pianos and things like that. So it was designed with a furniture mentality as opposed to a more utilitarian instrument mentality.
So talk a little bit about Rush.
So Rush was a Canadian rock band that started in the mid-70s, and they put out a lot of records and were big in the style of prog rock, and they're very, very famous, have a very, very passionate fan base. Neil Peart, which is the drummer who played this kit, joined them shortly after the band started. He was actually their second drummer. So he joined them on, I believe, what was their 3rd major tour, and ended up and became their chief lyricist. So this drum kit in particular is the last one he ever played on tour. Oh, I did not do that. This one was the last one he played on tour, and is made from a log that was found in a Romanian bog, preserved for over 500 years. So if you know how petrified wood works, this was a similar situation where a log had fallen underwater and been preserved from oxygenation by a layer of mud. This was only 500 years though, so the wood was not petrified, but it was much denser and it kind of been compressed by being on the bed of the river. They dredged it up, and Drum Workshop got a hold of it and made a prototype kit. Neil Peart got a chance to play one of those at one point and wanted an entire kit made out of it. So this whole drum set is made out of one log. They basically cut it into very thin sheets and then steam it together to make the shells. And so it's basically one of a kind as far as that goes, because there's just not much of that log available. The interesting thing, some of the custom things on this drum set, the hardware is all gold plated, and there are no cymbal stands in the traditional sense. So most cymbal stands have a sort of tripod base, and yeah, I know. And then, but these sort of screw into the bottom with pipe fittings, which is something that Neil Peart came up with and implemented. The drum set is, oh man, it weighs about, I can't remember how much, but the whole shipment was about a ton. And this octagon measures about 9 feet across. The cymbals are all signature to him, and other than that, the only one thing that you won't see on any other drum set is he does have this hand drying fan there.
So we look at Krupa and Rich's drums?
Sure, yeah.
Now, are these the actual drum sets that they played?
Yes. They have interesting, both of them have interesting provenance. So this drum set was owned by Gene Krupa. It's his signature from the 1960s. It wasn't one of the kits that he owned for the longest, but he did play this for several years. All the cymbals are also his. They're Zildjian A's. This one came to us through his son, so this one was left to his son, and then his son donated it to the museum. The drum set itself is actually pretty standard. This is one that was given to him for a tour. So the heads are all Slingerland, all the hardware is Slingerland, and there's and the cymbals are all Zildjian. As far as condition goes, it's in pretty good condition. If it wasn't Gene Krupa's, I'd probably play it.
Okay, and Buddy Rich over here.
Yeah. So this drum set was a Buddy Rich kit and was, I believe it was used for a couple gigs in Hawaii, and, or at least that's where he got it. It features a pretty similar aesthetic to the Gene Krupa set. I think that he sort of modeled his aesthetic after him. And it's a little bit later, Slingerland. So this is just a little later in the 60s, so the hardware is a little beefier. And it features, it's still the same tom mounting system, but if you see these legs on the cymbal stands and the hi-hat stands, they're a little thicker. So it's just a little later in the 60s. It also features a more antiquated throne. So Buddy Rich always played on these sort of older thrones that are barrel style, where instead of it being an adjustable stool, it's sort of just a cylinder of wood and then a seat on top. And so you could store stuff in that. It's sort of like a piano bench, but I think because he grew up playing on that height, he just stuck with it. Unlike some of the other guys, they sort of moved on to more modern things.
Was Buddy Rich a better drummer than Gene Krupa?
Yeah, he was.
He was?
Yeah.
Okay, these instruments are from Thailand.
Yeah. These instruments are the instruments that make up a Thai high-fat ensemble. So you have little tuned gongs, the two different kinds of xylophones, one made out of bamboo and one made out of another hardwood, which is escaping me right now. And then a drum, which is basically conducts the ensemble. Yeah, the tapone. And so the tapone player will conduct the ensemble, much like it's the same in like Indonesian gamelan and things like that. These instruments were donated, I believe, by Emil Richards, and this was another thing that he traded some Western instruments for. You play these instruments, the gong instruments you play by sitting in the middle and playing around you, and then these you would play as you might expect, just sitting behind it and playing. Otherwise, we have examples of mallets back there. The shorter mallets are what were used to play the metal instruments, and then the long, thin mallets are the ones that play the bamboo and wooden xylophones. And the finger cymbals back there are known as ching, and they're used to keep a pretty simple pulse in the ensemble.
So you've got a lot of things here in storage, it looks like.
Yeah. So we're lucky as a museum. A lot of museum storage is sort of behind closed doors,
or it's in the basement where you can't see it.
Yeah, we're lucky to have a space that has a glass wall, so we can keep some things on display. We have a lot of interesting timpani. This one is, even though it looks much older, dates back to about the 1930s. We have a lot of timpani through here. This drum set was played by Roy Knapp for the NBC Radio Orchestra in Chicago during the 1920s and 30s. And this is sort of a very early example of what we would call a drum set before it was sort of an idea, like the set product, so to speak. Drum sets in the very beginning consisted of a bass drum and a snare drum and basically whatever else they wanted to add to it. So you can see that he's got some timbales, a lot of little traps or sound effects, and Chinese tom-toms instead of what you would expect to see on a Western drum set. But you can see things from all sorts of different collections in here. We've got some samba instruments, some Middle Eastern instruments back there. Over here, military drums, maracas to your right.
What's this up here?
This is a Chinese xylophone. It's made out of bamboo, and I believe it's used in Chinese opera. I don't know a ton about that particular instrument. Right next to it is a drum set made where the shells are made entirely out of Legos. And that's made by a guy named Brian Melick out of Massachusetts. It's one of two in the world, I believe, like it, and he builds them himself.
A drum made out of Legos.
Yeah, so it's sort of a woven shell, and you wove it out of these 3s and 1s, so you can kind of create a bendable net, and then made a whole drum out of it. And that drum set will be on display pretty soon, actually.
And these down here?
These are the ones with the nails. These are Chinese tom-toms. And then behind it, we have some bird flappers from the musical Wicked. Those were actually invented by the drummer for that musical. There's a slit drum to the right. There are some train whistles in the back there. We have, let's see, this is a sort of cuica.
Brazilian.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got a few cuicas. These over here to the left, these metal ones are parade cuicas, which is why they have these little horns, so the sound projects forward a little bit.
Right. Noise is the main thing with samba bands.
Absolutely. And then there's a flexitone down there. There's a couple gas alarm sirens in the back from World War I. And I think it's about all that's in there. Well, there's some coconut shells, although one of them was broken.
Right. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Excellent. One thing I'm curious about, why was the center moved from Oklahoma to Indiana?
Oh, so the center was moved from Oklahoma to Indiana simply because PAS wanted to move to a city that was more amenable as sort of a home base for conventions. In the 90s, Indianapolis had started getting more and more common to come to for conventions. And in the early 2000s, they struck a deal with the convention center to come here 2 out of every 3 years. And then once that started happening, I think there's an organization in Indianapolis called Visit Indy that sort of recruited or PAS, or at least courted them, and led the way to finding this space for the museum and making the move make sense. So a lot of it has to do with the fact that our convention happens here 2 out of every 3 years still. Actually, right now it's going to be a few more years than that in a row here in Indy, and just this space allowed us to do a lot more than the original. The original building was a little smaller and didn't have quite the amount of space you needed to have all this interactive things.
Okay. Excellent.
Yeah.
Great.
Cool.